Hello everyone, my name is Julius. Thank you for having me, and today I'm going to talk about one of the hottest topics right now when it comes to Google Analytics 4. So, without further ado, let's take a look. The topic of my today's presentation is about Google Analytics 4 migration, and I want to share several good and bad practices when it comes to this process. My name is Julius. I am the founder of Analytics Mania, and if at some point in the past you were trying to learn Google Analytics or Google Tag Manager, there is a high chance that you at some point have landed on my website, or maybe you have viewed one of my YouTube videos. I'm also a founder of two popular Facebook groups. One is for Google Tag Manager users, and the other one is for Google Analytics 4. But that's enough about me. Let's tackle the main elephant in the room. My guess is that everyone is fed up with this notification when you log into your Universal Analytics property. It's annoying, and once you dismiss it, it will appear the next time you log in, but that's just a reminder of the reality that we are currently in. Universal Analytics is going away, it's going away soon, and many businesses will need to migrate to Google Analytics 4. And there are many places where you can make mistakes, so I hope that at least some of the items that I will mention in this presentation will be useful for you. So the first thing that you should do, at least that's what I believe in, is that you should try to learn Google Analytics 4 upfront as soon as possible and play around with it. There are many resources you can choose from: blog posts, from videos, you can take courses, and not necessarily my courses or my content. There are many other creators as well, so you can choose whatever you like. But my main point is that you should try to play around with Google Analytics 4 right now, because there is a steep learning curve. And even if you are an expert in Universal Analytics, GA4 is different by a lot. So by trying to learn it, to read about it, just to play around with it, you will start noticing that some things are different, some things are missing, and that might help you plan in the future how are you going to migrate your customers or your company. I have seen way too many people who try to dive into the migration process right away, and they think that they will learn everything on the go. Well, technically they can do that, but eventually you will hit way too many walls when you try to learn while actually migrating your clients. Instead, I would suggest that you should get familiar with GA4. You should also probably read more about the differences between two platforms, and that will help you prepare for some inevitable sacrifices when it comes to not having certain features or finding some workarounds for them. And also, by knowing Google Analytics 4 better, you will be able to set the right expectations for stakeholders or anyone who is involved with Google Analytics. For example, the first expectation should be that you will not be able to transfer your historic Universal Analytics data to Google Analytics 4. These platforms are very different, and because of the differences in data model, you cannot simply just export data from UA and then put it into GA4. Even if at some point in the near future Google comes up with some workaround, I'm more than sure that there will be so many caveats to that process that eventually there will not be that much benefit in exporting and importing data. Since Google Analytics 4 is very different from Universal Analytics and there's a steep learning curve, just as I've said, you should plan much more time on the migration than you probably already expect to do that. I mean, for example, in my Google Analytics 4 course, I share a migration checklist that contains almost 100 items that you should check when you are migrating, and you should consider whether this task must be done or not. And this is one of the chapters in that checklist, so this is probably just around 10% of what you should actually do when it comes to migration. Of course, maybe you're working with a very small website that has a very basic setup. In that case, the migration process will be fairly simple. But if you have done some customization, such as maybe you have custom dimensions in Universal Analytics, maybe you have user ID tracking, maybe you have something else, well, all of those things will need to be migrated, or at least the most important ones. In fact, speaking of migrating everything, I would suggest not doing that. In fact, you should review all your Universal Analytics events, and then I would recommend that you talk with people who are involved with Google Analytics at a company, and then just ask them, like, who is using which events. And surprisingly, I would say that you will find out that around at least 10, maybe 30% of events are not used anymore. So why should you migrate them to Google Analytics? They are already redundant. So try to look at the migration as the implementation of a new tool. Evaluate what you already have, find out what's important, and migrate only those events. Based on my experience, I have seen, as I've said, 10, 20, sometimes 30% of events that are no longer used. So that is a weight that you could easily get rid of when it comes to migration, and this would reduce the scope of your GA4 migration. So please don't migrate all events blindly from Universal Analytics to Google Analytics 4. And if you're migrating some events, you should take a look at the documentation of GA4 and the names of recommended events. Of course, recommended events do not mean that they are required, but in many cases, it will be healthy for you to review your current naming convention and see that maybe there could be done some changes. For example, we have a product click event right here, but instead of migrating this to a product click event like this one, in fact, there is a recommended event in Google Analytics 4 e-commerce tracking that is called select content. So don't rush to do that and check the documentation of GA4. And then the next step, which of course will take more time, but in the long run, I think that you will win, is to prepare some sort of migration or implementation plan. It could be as simple as just having some spreadsheet where you list all the events that you're going to track, what will be the names of the events, what will be some additional configurations, parameters, because that will help you foresee what are you going to track, what kind of parameters are you going to need in the data layer, maybe some information is missing and you need to involve developers as well. So in general, this will help you kind of audit what you already have and then what things are missing. And this is yet an additional step where you can review what kind of events do you have, do their names make sense to you? Maybe you can group several interactions under one event name. So this lets you see a broader picture of the migration that you're going to implement. By the way, speaking of event names, as you can see in this right column right here, I'm using all lowercase and underscores. This is the recommended naming convention of Google Analytics 4. And in the past, I was telling that recommended does not necessarily mean required. So if you want, you could name your events with spaces, but I always insisted that it was a good practice to follow this particular naming convention. Well, the more I worked with Google Analytics 4, the more I realized that this recommended naming convention might actually be quite required in certain cases. For example, if you are trying to use audience triggers and you want to create them from your audience, you won't be able to create an audience if that audience is using an event that is not following the naming convention. So for example, if I had an audience where I want to include people who had this scroll event feature with a space in it, well, with this event, I would get this error. I would not be able to create an audience trigger, while with all other events, this error would not be displayed. So even though this is recommended, I would say that you should look at the naming convention as a required one. But honestly, the more I work with Google Analytics 4, the more I like this recommended naming convention, because in the past, when I was looking at various Universal Analytics setups, I saw a variety of different naming conventions, and most of them actually, well, they looked like chaos, where some words are uppercase, some are lowercase, some are using underscores, some are using empty spaces. So to unify this, Google's recommendation is a bit more helpful when it comes to consistency among properties. So I would say that I'm leaning towards this recommended naming convention, and I quite like it. Then if we're talking about your Universal Analytics property and you have installed it by using GTag, which is the hard-coded Google Analytics tracking code, or maybe you're using the older version, which is called analytics.js, and you have those codes hard-coded in the source code of the website, maybe it would be time for you to consider to migrate not only to GA4, but also to Google Tag Manager. Because in the past, some companies could not find the budget to migrate to Google Tag Manager. So they stayed with the hard-coded Google Analytics setup. But since you are migrating to GA4, maybe it's time to consider an additional option because GTM will help you make your tag management or management of your tracking codes much more flexible. And all your tracking codes will be stored in one place, and marketers and analysts and implementation specialists, they will be able to manage them in one place, which will be far more convenient, and the implementation speed will be much faster. So I think that this is the moment where maybe you could use this to your advantage and convince stakeholders to maybe spend a little more money and a little more time, but eventually in the long run win with this migration. And if, on the other hand, you are already using Google Tag Manager and Universal Analytics is installed with GTM, then there's a good news that I would recommend using the same GTM container for Google Analytics 4 as well. And the good thing is that then you could use the same triggers, the same variables, if they make sense, for both versions of Google Analytics. This will make your migration faster because here, for example, let's say that I had this particular tag that was sending data to Universal Analytics. So this tag was using some variables, it was using this trigger, and right now I am able to quickly create this tag for GA4 where I can use the same variables and this trigger. So the migration process might be much faster. Of course, in some cases, your current Google Tag Manager container and Universal Analytics setup might be a huge mess. So in that case, of course, this might not be that big of an advantage. And in that case, I've seen some people creating a new container for just GA4 Fresh Start migration. And if that makes sense to you, I guess you could do that, but my recommendation would be to use the same container because everything should be stored in one place. But keep in mind that if you create a new container where you implement Google Analytics 4, then eventually you will need to migrate all the other tools, let's say Facebook Pixel, from your old container to your new container as well. And once GA3 stops working, then you will need to shut down that old Google Tag Manager container. Now, here's another thing which I am not a fan of. And when I do migrations or when I teach others to do migrations, I tell them not to connect Google Analytics 4 with the existing Universal Analytics tag. Sure, that's possible. And I mean, if you're working with a fairly small or basic Universal Analytics setup where you're just tracking page views, sessions, then sure, I mean, you could reuse the existing Universal Analytics tag. But if you have more customized setup where you're using user ID, maybe some custom dimensions, maybe something else, then I would say that you should look at GA4 as a fresh new tool that is being installed on a website, and it should not be connected to Universal Analytics. In fact, if you read the documentation of the migration, I mean, the official documentation of Google, then they list a lot of caveats where things that you have configured in your Universal Analytics G tag, they will not apply to Google Analytics 4. For example, user ID would not work, then certain page view attributes, then there are a lot of other customizations that will not apply to Google Analytics 4, even if you connect both versions. So just to avoid these nuances and these caveats, I recommend that you create a separate GA4 property and work with that. And when the time comes, then you will need to remove the hard-coded Universal Analytics tag. In fact, if you're already using GTag and you want to send the old data to Universal Analytics, but you want to also have a new setup where you're sending events only to your new property, then there is a parameter which is called send to, where you can define that this particular event will be sent to your new property and is not related to Universal Analytics property. Then another tip that I would highly recommend, but again, this takes more time, but you will learn more. So try to do your first migration 100% manually. And when I mean manually, I mean that you should not try to use tools that might help you do certain actions in bulk. Try to do the first migration manually so that you would understand how things work under the hood. And then when you do certain things manually and you see that, all right, I'm doing this action way too often, way too much, maybe I could speed things up, maybe I could automate. But first, I think that you need to grind and you need to see what are the problems, where are you struggling the most with the migration, and then try to find solutions to them. Because if you find some third-party tool that can do the migration for you, you might not understand what are the possible implications of such migration. Maybe they will not migrate certain features, maybe something will be missing. But when you already know how things work under the hood, then I think you could take a look at some third-party tools. However, keep in mind that there is no magical tool that will do everything for you. Again, unless you're working with some very basic setup in Universal Analytics where you are just tracking sessions, maybe several events, and that's it. Well, in that case, those third-party tools might be able to help you because they will just basically create Google Tag Manager GA4 tags for you based on what you already have related to Universal Analytics. But there are still many things that cannot be migrated because GA4 does not support some features of Universal Analytics. So some things just cannot be migrated. For example, Universal Analytics has a thing called custom task, and GA4 does not have it. GA4 does not offer comprehensive filters, the ones that we had in views of Universal Analytics. Right now, there are no session scoped custom dimensions. There are no calculated metrics. There is no AdSense integration, and so on. So this is yet another reason why I think that you should try to play around and learn about Google Analytics 4 beforehand as soon as possible before you do the migration, because then you will know certain caveats, certain missing things, and maybe that will help you consider how are you going to implement this new GA4 setup. But speaking of some third-party migration tools, there are several of them. Some of them are paid. There are also some free tools, even though the interface of this, for example, tool is Google Sheets. So not all things are intuitive when you're using this for the first time, but it can definitely help you speed up some things and some tasks that require a lot of repetition. So once you are familiar with the manual setup and manual migration process, then I would say you can try this migration tool just to help you speed things up. But of course, keep in mind that, for example, this GA4 GTM migration tool by Ben Kuhn, this works only if your Universal Analytics is already installed with Google Tag Manager, because it will basically take certain tags from Universal Analytics, and then you will be able to configure some additional things that will be applied to newly created GA4 tags. But again, set your expectations right. There is no tool. It might be a third-party tool, it might be some official Google's tool, but no tool will do the entire migration for you unless your Universal Analytics setup is very basic. But if you have some customizations, not all of them can be easily translated to GA4, and some of them might not be implemented in GA4 at all. Then another thing, this caused some buzz in February when we learned about automatically configured and automatically created GA4 properties. So in February, we were able to opt out of certain features because otherwise Google would have created GA4 properties for you with some additional configuration, but those configurations do not necessarily mean that you would have benefited from them. In fact, if you go to the official documentation of Google, they say that you should migrate manually instead of relying on these automatic migration features. So the deadline for opting out of automatic migration was either February 28th or maybe March 1st, I think. But if you have already missed that deadline and now you have a bunch of new GA4 properties, I would say that you should go to that newly created GA4 property and then disconnect it. So if you see that it is connected right here, you should disconnect it and look at GA4 and GA3 as two separate analytics tools, two separate platforms that should not be connected. I don't know what is Google's plan in the near future, but I don't want to find out about that actually. So I want to stay safe and I just want to disconnect GA4 from GA3. So when you eventually implement Google Analytics 4 on your website or maybe your client's website, then the time comes to verifying and making sure that you have implemented everything properly. And that's where you need to set another expectation. So don't expect that Google Analytics 4 numbers will match your Universal Analytics, at least in many cases. Of course, some events should be comparable, but there will still be some discrepancy. Some of them can be explained, some of them unfortunately not. And if you are in that situation, don't forget that you are not alone in this. I have found myself also in many situations where I have that discrepancy, and sometimes you just cannot properly explain it because of some magical way how GA4 processes data, or maybe how it is impacted by bots, and it's impacted probably much more than Universal Analytics, or maybe something else. So when you have implemented both versions, I would suggest that you compare them side by side. So you take page views, and you take the number of page views in Universal Analytics and then in GA4. In GA4, page views is called just views. So you need to take a look at the metric called views, and then you calculate the difference. From my experience, I would say anything below 5% is a pretty good difference. If you have, let's say, 1% difference or even less, that is great. Then when it comes to users, the difference might be much higher because of the way how Google Analytics is configured. For example, maybe you are sending also data with consent mode, and part of your data is modeled by machine learning algorithms that are trying to fill in the gaps of your data. So in that case, the number of users will very likely be different when it comes to comparing both versions. However, when it comes to event counts or transactions, the numbers should be close enough. So if you have, let's say, more than 5% difference, I would say this is a red flag and you should be looking at certain issues. Maybe your technical implementation is incorrect. So when it comes to measuring things that are not processed a lot, for example, again, event counts, transactions, then your numbers should be as close as possible. But again, they will not match 100%. In fact, if you had two Universal Analytics properties installed on the same website with the same configuration, I would say that there is still a chance of maybe 0.5%, but there will still be some differences because sometimes maybe one property throws an error and cannot track that purchase. Maybe in some cases, something else happens. So you should keep in mind that you will not have 100% accurate data and matching data between both GA versions. So to sum up, here are the things that you should do, at least that's what I believe in, when it comes to migration of Google Analytics 4. You should start learning GA4 as soon as possible. And I know, it's already quite late to start the migration right now, but it's better now than never or even later. So start learning right now, start migrating right now. But if it is possible, for example, maybe you're planning to do a migration after a month, then try to spend that month right now learning and reading about GA4, because that will help you avoid certain obstacles in the near future. Then review your Universal Analytics setup and find all the unnecessary stuff. I can bet that there are some events that are no longer used, so why should you bother migrating them? Then prepare some migration/implementation plan where you list all the events that you're going to track, what kind of parameters will they have, because this will help you see a bigger picture, and maybe it will help you even sometimes consolidate certain events under the same event name. Then, if you haven't yet, consider migrating to GTM2, because right now is the moment where you could sell the GTM migration as well to the stakeholders. Then try to do your first migration manually, because this will help you see how different parts are moving, and it will help you understand what is happening under the hood. And then if at some point Google starts to pushing some other things related to automatic migration, try to avoid them and try to opt out, because no automatic migration will do the entire job for you, unless, again, you're working with super basic Universal Analytics setup with no customization. And then finally, when you see the data, you should compare what you have in Universal Analytics and what you have in GA4. Not all things can be compared, because some things are apples and others are oranges, but there are other things that could be compared. For example, you could still look at the top 5 traffic sources and see if they are the same top 5 traffic sources in Google Analytics 4. However, keep in mind that I think you should collect the data at least for several weeks, maybe a month, just to have enough data to be able to compare that. And the things that you should avoid is to not expect to transfer historic data from Universal Analytics to GA4, even if somehow magically Google comes up with that solution, I'm more than certain that there will be so many caveats and so many potential problems that I would not bet on this ever happening, or I would not bet that this will be quite accurate. Then don't blindly migrate all your Universal Analytics events. Review what is important, what is not, and then remove what is necessary only. Then, apparently, you should not use spaces or special characters in events. The only special character that should be used is the underscore. In most cases, event names, even with a space, will work. But as you have seen, one of the examples was audience triggers, where you cannot create an audience trigger just because one of the events in the audience configuration was using a space. Then I would not recommend connecting Universal Analytics tags to GA4. Look at GA4 as a standalone, separate tool that requires care. Then don't expect some magical third-party tool that will solve all your migration problems unless you are working with a very basic Universal Analytics setup. Those tools will help you speed up some things, but they will not be able to solve all the problems and all the challenges because some things just cannot be migrated easily or cannot be migrated at all. But just to remind you, I would say that your first migration should be manual, just so you could learn more. And then after that, see if you can improve your speed by using some third-party tools. And when it comes to verification and validation of your setup, don't expect that your numbers will match between both versions. However, you should do your best to minimize the discrepancy between both platforms. So I hope that at least some of these tips were helpful and maybe they gave you some additional ideas when it comes to migration. But if you want to learn even more, I have a lot of content and a lot more content about migration, and I explain that very in-depth in my Google Analytics 4 course. And if you're working on the migration right now, I have a free ebook, which is about 8 steps of a successful GA4 migration. So if you want to get that ebook, go to analyticsmania.com/GA4migration, enter your email address, download the ebook, and then hopefully learn something new. So again, thank you for inviting me to this awesome event. And my name is Julius. I'm from Analytics Mania, and I hope that you found this presentation useful.